Hi, and welcome back to Series 2 of the Pen to Publish podcast with Alexa Whitten and Alexa Tewksbury. Now, in our last series, we talked about the basics, what you need to do, how to get some ideas, really the structural stuff that you need before you start writing a book. And in this series, we're going to be talking about the editing side of things. Now, I'm not an editor, but the lovely Alexa one is. So this series is going to be a lot of her contribution to this subject, obviously, because it's her area of expertise. And I'm going to be chiming in, obviously, with my bits that I've learned along the way, and also what I've learned about the editing process through my typesetting and publishing. And I think it's this combination of learning from an expert, also having my view as an avid reader, really then contributes to make sure that we have a fantastic end result. So we're going to be talking, as I said, about the editorial side of the process. However, as a book coach, I do know how to structure good writing. I offer a structural editing service. So I'll be popping in and out with some of my tips of my own. When I lay out a book and I know if the book has been edited or not, usually the client will say something along the lines of, oh, well, my brother's wife's sister is an English teacher and she's edited her book. This isn't good enough, I'm afraid, because an English teacher isn't an editor. And I'm sure Alexa One will agree with me on this. You've heard this, I'm sure, a lot.
Yes, we won't go there.
Basically, we need you to really understand that the editorial process is something that you do and something you really need help with. And an editor is only going to make your writing better. They're not going to make your writing worse. And all decent writers, from the top people, will have proper editors on board. So don't think that it's something that you skip. This is really something you need to invest in. So without further ado, let's get on with talking about the editing and how you need to prep your manuscript before the editor can then work on it. So Alexa, welcome back. Nice to see you.
Welcome back. Nice to see you too. We missed each other. We did. We schedule in a recording the podcast each week. And then I think it was the first week after we'd finished series 1. It was like, I miss listening to Alexa. Yes.
I think I WhatsApped you and I had a little conversation going, I miss our chat.
You said we should be recording now.
I know, exactly. Anyway, so Alexa One, right. Over to you with how to get your manuscript ready for the editing process.
Yeah, there's lots to talk about here. So you've written your book, you're very excited. You may be feeling a huge sense of accomplishment because after all, you've written a book. And yes, if you're thinking, do I need an editor? The answer is always, you do need an editor. Now, your editor is going to cost you some money, but think of the editing stages as an investment. You're investing in your product. You've written a wonderful book and you've spent many weeks, months, or maybe even years on it. And you want to make sure it's the best it can possibly be. Now, next week, we're going to be talking about the different types of editing that are available and why each stage is beneficial. But for now, I would just say that if your manuscript is the raw material, then the editing process is the refining of that raw material. Now, when you're writing a book, it's hard to get it all right all by yourself. It's like if you're hanging a big picture on a wall, you need someone else to tell you if it's straight. And an editor provides that invaluable fresh pair of eyes, and they can work on your book with you in a collaborative and objective manner.
Oh, I like that analogy. They're going to make your book look better. You don't want a crooked picture on your wall. You want a perfectly straight one. So it always surprises me when people are reluctant about this. Yes, it can be exposing to have a professional look at your work, but don't you want your work to be the best it can be? Of course. So in a way, you kind of have to, the phrase that I really like is you need to step out of your own way, be brave, and let your book go.
Yeah, let your book go to the next stage. That's a really good one. And I understand the attachment authors have to their manuscripts. I've written books and I've been edited, and it can be daunting opening up a file that you thought was pretty well okay and then finding the editor's red markup. I've even found mistakes I've made in manuscript that have been corrected by an editor, and I've been so sure I didn't make those mistakes that I've checked back on my original document, only to find that I had made the mistake, but it took a fresh pair of eyes to see it. So editing matters, it really does. And as I say, we'll go through the various editing processes and how they can help your writing more deeply next week. But for now, we're just going to focus on getting your manuscript ready to send out to an editor. So the first thing I would say, and we actually touched on this in the first series, but typing your book in Word using a clear, simple font like Times New Roman is a great start. Most editors work in Word because they can use its tools to mark up the manuscript and suggest amendments. And there's no need for you to do any fancy layouts either. In fact, editors positively don't want you to spend your time creating fancy layouts because it makes the whole process of editing more time consuming as they try to navigate and undo what you've done. You don't need to make your Word docs look like the pages of a book. The book designer and typesetter will do that for you. And I know that, Alexa, too, you have some particular bugbears when it comes to typesetting, where an author has done things they don't need to do, and you then have to set about undoing them.
Yes, I do. Now, for fiction, you don't need any fancy formatting, apart from obviously clear denotions of where the chapter numbers and name, if applicable, are going to be. Now, I think Alexa one's going to explain about how you incorporate page breaks, and that's a really important tool to know about. The one thing that I do see in a lot of amateur writings is they put on headers and footers. And what I mean by headers and footers is they will put in the header the title of their book, and they'll put in the footer the page number they're on. Actually, I find these really annoying. It's the first thing that I do is take them off. I know what the title of your book is. It says it right at the beginning. So please don't be fiddling around with formatting. It wastes your time, and it wastes both the editors and the typesetter's time as well. Now, business books are slightly more complicated because obviously within business books, you're going to have a heading hierarchy. Now, I'm going to be talking about heading hierarchy in another series that we're going to be doing all about typesetting. It's too complicated to go in here, but this is usually something that I actually discuss with the client, and I will take them through how to set the heading hierarchy up. So if you're writing fiction, it's just a clear denotion of where the chapter numbers and the chapter names are. Take the headers and take the footers off.
Okay, so we've talked about what not to do, but now let's look at what you can do with your Word document that's helpful. Different editors may have different requirements, so it's always worth checking with them how they'd like you to submit your manuscript. But doing these next few basic things with your Word document is always useful and will help save your editor some time and therefore you some money. So first of all, set your line spacing to 1.5 or even 2. It just makes it much easier to read on the screen if there's more white space. And don't justify the text. Now, justified text is where the left and the right margins of the text are aligned. And text in printed books tends to be justified, but that's part of the typesetter's design process. If you justify your Word document, the word spacing can end up a bit all over the place, so it's easier for your editor to receive it unjustified. And then, as Alexa 2 mentioned, inserting a page break at the end of each chapter or section so that the next one begins on a fresh page is really helpful. Your editor can do this for you, but again, it saves them a little time if you've already broken the manuscript up before submitting it. And you don't have to keep pressing return to get yourself to the top of the next page. To insert a proper page break, when you open a document, click on the Insert tab at the very top and select Page Break from the far left-hand side, and Word will then insert the page break automatically and shoot you to the top of a new page. Now, if you'd like to learn more about formatting your manuscript for editing in Microsoft Word, I can't recommend enough a blog post by a brilliant editor called Louise Harmby. Now, she is a goldmine of skill and knowledge when it comes to writing and editing. And this post of hers really is worth looking at. It's called How to Prepare Your Book File for a Fiction Editor. But the principles are the same for nonfiction too. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I do think it's worth reading just to give you an idea of how to create the optimum Word file for an editor. Right, now the next step in getting your manuscript ready is less technical, and it involves some really thorough self-editing on your part as the author. Keep bearing in mind that you're paying for your editor's time. And if you can minimize the hours your editor has to spend on correcting the little things, you make the editing process a much more cost-effective one for yourself. Submitting a manuscript that's as clean as you can make it also means that your editor can really focus on the important issues. For example, if you're new to writing and you're including speech, it's worth making sure you know how to punctuate speech correctly. If an editor has to correct the punctuation in every line of speech, it's going to turn into something much more time-consuming than just a relatively simple job. And it means they might miss something else when they're focusing on making the speech right. I must say my heart does sink a bit when I find speech that hasn't been formatted correctly because I know I'm going to have a lot of amending to do. And it's the same with spelling errors. Double check your spellings, double check for typos.
Can you just give us some tips on punctuating speech correctly? What do you mean by that?
Well, if you look in any fiction book, you'll see how speech is laid out. The end punctuation after someone has spoken always goes inside the speech mark. So, for instance, if someone's asking a question, at the end of that, you need a question mark. So, are you going to the library? Question mark. But the question mark comes after library, but before the closing speech mark. So basically, any punctuation at the end of a piece of speech goes inside the speech mark. That's direct speech. There are lots of grammar and punctuation tips online, and I think, again, it's worth looking at those just to make sure that you do know what you're doing when it comes to formatting things like speech. But there's also, I'm reaching now for a little book, and I don't know why I'm doing that because this is audio and you can't see it, but I've got a brilliant book called Oxford A to Z of Grammar and Punctuation by John Seeley, and I'll put the link to where you can buy it in the show notes. But that's just full of really everything that you might need to know in the grammar and punctuation of your book. Now, in fiction, something that can be helpful in catching spelling errors and consistency issues is to list character and place names that you're including and any unusual words. Now, this can help you to keep to the same spellings of these words throughout your book. You'd be surprised how easy it is for Elizabeth with a Z to morph gradually as you write into Elizabeth with an S, for example. And a list like this is also really useful for your editor because it means they can keep checking back quickly and easily to make sure you've always used the spelling you intended. Now, your editor will create their own style sheet as they're going through your book, and it'll likely be more detailed than the one that you're doing, but having some basics that you can give them in a list will certainly save them time.
I'm going to quickly jump in here about speech, just to go back to speech, because this is one thing that really annoys me. And I think I've mentioned this earlier in an earlier episode because it annoys me that much. We're not expecting you, obviously, to be perfect, but there's one bugbear that I have. And it's this: when you're writing dialogue and you're having a dialogue between two people, don't include the name of the other person that you're talking to within your dialogue. Because when you're talking to someone, you very rarely mention the other person's name when you're talking directly to them. And yet somehow in writing, it happens a lot and it's really annoying. If it's dialogue between two people, don't do it. If it's dialogue between four people, you might need to be more careful about how you do it so that you know who's speaking to who and who's talking. I promise I won't mention it again. Don't do it because it's really annoying. So I'm just going to put that out there about speech. Okay. Record how you speak to someone else and then use that when you're doing dialogue, because I think great dialogue makes a great book and a poor dialogue makes for a crappy book.
Yeah, that's a really good idea, actually, because I think sometimes we don't write the way we speak. If you listen to how you yourself speak, it can really help you with writing dialogue. Anyway, back to self-editing. It's probably worth mentioning beta readers for this stage too. Now, a beta reader you may have heard of will read and feed back on a book before it's published and before it's edited. That's not vital, and a lot of writers may well not feel it's necessary, but beta readers can highlight plot flaws or inconsistencies in fiction or point out elements that are perhaps missing in a non-fiction book. And it just gives you the chance to fix these issues too before an editor starts work.
How do you go about getting beta readers, Alexa?
Well, I have come across editors who offer a beta reading service if you're happy to pay for it. However, a good place to look for beta readers is among other authors. So go online and look for writing communities. Facebook is a good place for these, and LinkedIn too. And in fact, Alexa, too, you have a writers group on Facebook too, the Reluctant Writers Group. So that might be a good one to join. Yes, she's giving me a thumbs up. So join the Reluctant Writers Group, that is. We can put that in the show notes too.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Or you may belong to a physical writing group where you live. I mean, it may have been online during the pandemic, but if you know people within a writing group that you belong to who would be happy to read your book and provide feedback, then use them. And similarly, if you know any other authors, they may be happy to help too. And in exchange, perhaps you could be a beta reader for their next book. And I think as if someone has been a beta reader for your book, it's always nice to give them a copy of that book when it's actually published, just as a thank you. Now, all of this isn't about getting the editing done before sending your manuscript for actual editing. It's about getting your book to the best possible level you can, as polished as you can make it, before the editor sees it, because that then helps editors to do their best work. And importantly, it helps authors to get the most out of their editor's time. Oh, one final thing that's important to do is make sure that you've communicated what you want for your book to your editor in a style guide. Again, it doesn't have to be hugely detailed. If you have spelling preferences, for example, let your editor know. There's a group of spellings, ISE spellings, so I-Z-E or I-S-E. You might have a preference for an I-Z-E or an I-S-E, so realise with a Z or realise with an S. Write it down, let your editor know. And if, for example, you're writing a business book for the US market, make sure your editor knows that you want American spellings and phrasing. If there are any particular design elements, like tables, for example, in non-fiction, or bullet lists, let your editor know so that they can make sure there's consistency in those elements and they're marked up appropriately for the typesetter.
So another quick tip, I'm going to jump in here with style guides and things that you need to look out for is contractions. Now, we ought to write how we talk. I've spoken to you about that with obviously direct speech, but this can be done for business books as well. It's really interesting. I think, Alexa, you briefly touched on the fact that somehow people don't write as they speak. We sometimes write very formally when we're writing. It's bizarre. I do it. I hold my hand up. So contractions, this is where you put two words together, usually with an inverted comma. So for instance, it is becomes its, they are becomes their, you are becomes your, etc. Now, I really like contractions in writing. I think it makes it much easier for the reader to read. Even in business books, I'm a fan. So I would say have that conversation with your editor at the beginning. But if you want contractions used, and I'd always say do, then put that on your style guide as well, because you might have caught some in your Word document, but you might not have caught them all.
Well, I think that's covered quite a lot of preparing your manuscript as far as submitting it to an editor goes. Is there anything else to bear in mind that can help the typesetter? Because obviously I'm not involved in the typesetting process. And I know that with some publishers I work with, I have to mark up manuscripts for the typesetter. But is there anything that would help?
I briefly talked about headings for business books because I think that is quite important to get established correctly. Now, that's usually my job. I mean, it's quite a complicated subject. And obviously, as I've said, we'll go into more detail about this in the typesetting series. Everything you've covered really is spot on. And I think it's just about communication at the end of the day. I do know with some editors, and I've heard this on LinkedIn, that if you don't submit your manuscript in the way that the editor wants, they'll either charge you more or decline the project. I mean, some editors can be that picky. So it's all about communication and listening. And I think the headers and the footers thing is a little bit of an ego trip. And when we ask for it to be got rid of, take your ego out of the equation and just get rid of it. Make our lives easier. I think that's what it's all about. It's about making the people that you're hiring's life easier. Otherwise, it's just going to cost you more money. So I think it's about communication and listening to what they're saying and then doing what they're saying as well. I think we've really covered quite a lot in this episode, considering it's only about getting your manuscript ready. Most people wouldn't think there was anything really involved with that. Line spacing, I think, is really important, like you said, and using a font that's easy to read on screen as well. So that's it for this episode. Remember, less is more. And we definitely need an electronic version of your book. Next week, we're going to be talking about the different types of editing. And I know that's going to be a goodie and probably quite long because there are quite a few different ways of editing, what style of book, who it's for, etc. So,
and let's face it, I do go on.
Only in the best possible way. It's all about education. And I think if our readers and our authors know what goes on behind the scenes, it's going to make everyone's job so much easier. That's it from us. It's a goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.